Chapter 16. Arranged to die in early June 1979. Doctors in Palo Alto removed a lump from Bettelheim's breast and found it to be malignant. They assured her and Bruno that the cancer had not spread and that with aggressive radiation therapy, the prognosis was hopeful. The couple made trip after trip to the Stanford Medical Center for the treatments, but by the end of the summer the physicians were recommending more surgery. Trude rejected the idea of a mastectomy, and an other localized procedure was performed, after which Bruno tried to be optimistic. In September, he wrote to Carl Frankenstein that as a result of this U.S.C. operation, Trude was fully restored and, as the doctors say, cured. Superscript 1. But behind his words was the realization that Trude, who was 8 years younger than he was and had always been so much more robust, might die before he did. He had leaned on this woman he called his good wife for 40 years, ever since she ran to him from Australia in 1939. Even before that, she had loved and cosseted him in Vienna as his marriage to Gina fell apart. She had been the perfect mate for a man who demanded center stage, a partner willing to stay in the background, to listen patiently to his complaints and buoy him up through his repeated bouts of depression. She had raised the children, run the household, cooked the meals, even cut his meat. In Portola Valley, she had continued to care for her man, while reveling in the California sunshine with her usual hearty enthusiasm, digging in the garden, learning tennis. Now the radiation had made Trude weak and sickly. By October 1981, the cancer had spread to the bone. She underwent further radiation therapy, as well as hormone treatments and, soon, chemotherapy. At one point, her third vertebra collapsed because of a tumor, causing such pain that she could not walk. She was rushed by ambulance to the medical center, where she remained through the Christmas holidays, after which she returned home on a regimen of drugs that at least made the pain bearable. She could move about the house with the aid of a walker and was able to sit up for half an hour at a time, but she needed almost constant attention. Though Bruno tried to provide it, he was not psychologically inclined to reverse the equation of care that had obtained for so many years. This reluctance was compounded by his own worsening health. Earlier in 1981, he had been about to drive to teach a class when he noticed some clumsiness in his left hand as he tried to use the turn indicator and operate the window, and when he attempted to button his jacket. An examination at his home that night revealed no major abnormalities, nor did a CAT scan 2 days later. Nonetheless, his doctor concluded that he had suffered a mild stroke. The diagnosis only deepened the anxiety of a man who, at 77, already had severe circulatory problems in his legs as well as heart disease. His 2 cataract operations had helped his eyesight, but he continued to suffer from diabetes, arthritis, a slightly enlarged prostate, and the esophageal blockage, which made eating more and more unpleasant. In 1980, he had contracted a mild case of tuberculosis and also wound up with his leg in a cast for several weeks after a bad fall, an accident that left him using cocaine. Superscript 2. In recent years, Bruno had suggested from time to time that he and Trude move into a retirement home, where someone would be available to look after them if they had to grapple with just what was now happening. She would not hear of it. She loved their house and found abhorrent the notion of moving into a home for the elderly, as in fact did her husband, who only proposed the idea as a matter of expediency. He tried to be sanguine as he faced the future. "We are determined to fight it out," he told Nancy Dayton, "because we hope that we may still have a few years together." Superscript 3. One solace the couple had was the proximity of Eric and Ruth. Their son now practiced law in San Francisco and could see them frequently. Ruth was able to visit occasionally from Pasadena, where she was a therapist and lived with her husband, an urban planner named Daniel Flaming, and their 2 children, but was living in London, where her husband knew the distance. After Trude's long siege in the hospital over Christmas 1981, Naomi had flown in from England and stayed at one airplane for many days to help care for her mother. Though Bruno and Trude lamented that Naomi resided so far away, they were glad to see her settled. In the late 1960s, she had married a physics student with an interest in painting whom she had met in Mexico. Her parents were at best ambivalent about the match,
not least because their daughter was only in her early 20s and her husband was a Catholic and spoke little English. They were quite relieved that he wasn't dark-skinned, Naomi recalled. The couple tried to make a go of the relationship while Naomi pursued her degree in regional planning at the University of North Carolina, but by 1970 they had separated. That her new husband was a British professional and Jewish, with a deep interest in Israel, where the couple spent their honeymoon in the spring of 1981, particularly pleased her parents. "We like him a lot," Bruno told Carl Frankenstein in a letter, saying that he had urged the newlyweds to call on him and his wife, Aljuba, when they were in Jerusalem. For Bruno and Trude were not so happy about Ruth's marriage. Daniel Flaming had been raised as a fundamentalist Christian, and some of his relatives looked askance at his marrying a Jew, the misgiving Bruno reciprocated. When the Flaming's first child was born, in 1975, he wrote Frankenstein that it was good to see such confidence in the future, but complained that Ruth had married a Gentile. 7 years and one more grandchild later, he was still upset, telling Frankenstein that his beloved oldest daughter has a boy homesick for a husband. He speculated that Ruth married him because she was too attached to meat and had to guard against her unconscious incestuous tendencies. 6. This edible analysis is less likely the explanation than the Christmas tree at 5725 Kentwood Avenue and Bettelheim's repeated public admonitions that all Jews should died. That he sometimes murmured a counter-message in private, as when he told a counselor Karen Carlson she was ill-advised to marry a Jew, made little impact at home. Naomi feels that after she and then Ruth went off and married Gentiles, both of her parents may have had second thoughts about the secular upbringing they had provided for their children. Certainly her father had moved closer to his Jewishness since his visit to Israel in 1964. He did not want to live there, he was no Zionist, but his letters to Nancy Dayton and Carl Frankenstein repeatedly show that he saw the Israelis as brave and heroic, mentioned on the barricades against Jew hatred, which he felt was rife well beyond the Middle East. As always, work provided the end on the onset of Trude's illness. He began a book. Olson, who had not taken his advice and had married a Jewish university administrator named Joseph Zelon and was living in Berkeley. He had also been invited to deliver the paper at Stanford in connection with an exhibition of photos illustrating Sigmund Freud's life, and chose to deal with what he regarded as the misconception of Freud's ideas caused by James Strachey's mistranslations in the English language standard edition. He told Joyce Jack, who continued to edit his writing from the East Coast, that giving the paper was not all that important, but his thoughts on this subject were. He wanted to see them in print, and once again asked her to help make his ideas publishable. 7. While working on these projects, Bettelheim continued to accept occasional speaking engagements around the country. He was reluctant to leave Trude, and traveling had become trying, but the forays did both his retirement income and his morale. When he appeared at Rhode Island College in November 1979, an audience of 700 crammed into an auditorium that seated 550, and 300 more watched his lecture on closed-circuit television. 8. The following summer, more than 300 persons jammed in to hear him talk about the family at a day-long session at the University of California Extension Center in San Francisco. When speaking to such audiences, he almost always employed the unique and often unsettling brand of Socratic dialogue that had stood him in such good stead since his Rockford days. He rarely prepared his talk, but instead offered a few ice-breaking remarks and then called for questions. In San Francisco, this approach caused a good deal of muttering from a crowd that had paid $30 a head to hear the world-famous Viennese-born psychoanalyst, the esteemed former director of the renowned orthogenic school. A polymath who could shine his lamp into the darkest corners of autism as well as over the magic landscape of fairy tales. The first questioner asked, tentatively, "Would you comment on the homosexual family?" and Bettelheim cut her off. "The homosexual family is not viable," he shouted. "Such a union was a contradiction the good Lord did not intend." This was the Bay Area, and the anger and disappointment among several gay couples in the auditorium was manifest. Bettelheim called for a dictionary. When someone brought him the American Heritage volume, he declared that he preferred Webster's, but he made do, and stressed the definition of the family as a procreational unit. He conceded he was an old man with an old man's crotchets. He growled about California's exotic lifestyle, which he said produced more divorces than marriages in nearby Marin counties, and about parents' unreasonable expectations that their children live up to his height of the front of the auditorium asked what he could do about his 22-year-old daughter, who lived in the East and refused to communicate with him. When he confessed that he had left his wife and child 9 years earlier, Bettelheim shouted, "Then you deserted her." The audience sucked in its breath. Bettelheim dropped his judgmental tone yet remained forbidding, telling the questioner that his daughter had needed him and explaining that a child responds to the definite situation. If the father is present, she deals with him. If he is gone, good riddance. Bettelheim larded his performance with reminiscences of Vienna, including an oft-told tale of a 15-year-old black sheep cousin. He explained that the boy's family was the cause of his delinquent behavior but didn't realize it. Thus, instead of berating themselves, as so many contemporary middle-class American parents did when their children sulked or spun out of control, they took up a collection and sent the boy to the United States, the geographic solution that drew much laughter from the audience. He said that his nameless cousin did well on the streets of gold, his point being that American children remained socially and economically dependent on their parents for too long. He held out the children of the dream as exemplary products of the right alternative approach. The young kibbutzniks grew up away from their parents, so free of teenage resentments that generational conflict was virtually non-existent, as were delinquency, drug addiction, and other pathologies of the counterculture. Once again, he was repeating dubious research and generalities over the flame of infallibility. Children were indeed raised physically apart from their parents in the first decades of the kibbutz movement, but this arrangement had never produced the emotional divide between parents and offspring that he maintained it had, and tensions within families were by no means unknown. Moreover, by 1980 most kibbutz parents were with their children at home, and the mené system was on the verge of extinction. As for hippedom, kibbutz teenagers merely came to it a few years later than their counterparts in the United States and Europe. By the mid-1970s, many of them, too, were puffing on joints and experimenting with LSD, their long hair falling over infrequently bathed bodies. They now took a haughty and iconoclastic view of the once sacrosanct kibbutzim, demanding their freedom, and drifting away in such numbers that the future of the movement was for a time in doubt. Superscript 1 degrees. Bettelheim told his audience that parents had to know their own minds and make their standards clear to their children in no uncertain terms. By way of example, he recalled the evening in the late 1960s when he turned on the lights at Eric's high feeding his son. This reunion a few years later and encountered the friend who had turned out the lights. Bruno said the boy told Eric that his father had been right to turn the lights back on. Eric confirmed the story, but told me that one of the things that annoyed him about his father was his willingness to use family incidents such as this in his books and lectures. In early 1982, Bettelheim's collaboration with Karen Ziwan came to fruition with I'm Learning to Read, The Child's Fascination with Meaning, an attack on reading education in the United States. Superscript 1 Robert Gottlieb, who remained Bettelheim's editor at Knopf, had warned that the manuscript was repetitious and dogmatic and suffered from too much simplistic and often far-fetched psychoanalytic interpretation. Superscript 1 He had urged Bettelheim to expunge just such writing from the uses of enchantment with only moderate success, and he made even less headway with this latest book. As several reviewers pointed out in the critical beverage, the authors had blown what should have been a concise 5,000-word article into a flabby book. Superscript 1 Superscript 3 They had tried to defend the magic of reading in a turgid, repetitious prose redundant of the green walls of ed-psych labs. Superscript 1 They had lamented the mind-numbing repetitiveness of primers, yet their book itself grown dead with the weight of ideas endlessly repeated. Superscript 1 Even a critic who lauded the book's enthusiasm for the joys of reading found it a little repetitive and even tedious. Superscript 1 Besides decrying the monosyllabic banality of most basal readers, the book attacked their portrayal of life as always sunny, a world full of happy families with no problems. What is this? Bettelheim asked in a chapter that he alone wrote, are made available to the child who is asked to develop interest in reading, not to mention literature, by learning to read. Janet. Mark. Janet and Mark. Come, Mark, come, Mark, come here. Superscript 17. He said that, after he had won the confidence of children in schools he had visited, a flood of angry criticisms poured forth attacking such primers. Without exception, the children said the books were stupid, that they hated having to read them. With venom, these grade schoolers spoke of the sweet little kids in the stories. The neophyte readers were furious that adults would regard them as so simple-minded as to believe that children were really like that. For all the spleen of this remarkable group of maniacs, their and the author's criticisms were hardly new. As Bettelheim and Ewen themselves noted, the front morality that dominated primers had been dissected as long ago as 1901, suggested that the authors decided to throw some old observations into a book instead of the wastebasket. Superscript 1. Bettelheim had in fact gone to his files, recycling in 3 of the chapters that he alone wrote material from an article he had published 8 years earlier, in which he had deplored as insipid the Janet and Mark series of primers then popular in schools. Superscript 2 degrees. Few argued that such readers could not usefully be made more imaginative and relevant, but Bettelheim seemed determined to dismiss altogether the importance of any instruction that stressed phonics and graphemes. It is high time, he wrote in another solo riff, at the end of the book, that children and teachers were freed of the yoke and the blinders that are the direct result of teaching reading, as if its ultimate purpose is the acquisition of decoding skills, and as if the only way to become able to recognize a word is to be exposed to it innumerable times. The truth is that words are learned easily and fast if we are interested in what they mean to us. Superscript 2. Superscript 1. As a reading specialists have long known, the truth is a great deal more complicated than that. Just how we learn to read remains largely a mystery. What is known, however, is that for most children decoding is a crucial first step to reading, and leads to just the kinds of exciting books that Bettelheim championed. To Jerome Bruno, the Harvard psychologist and pioneer in the field of cognition, the authors seemed unable to digest the fact that, for reasons longer than a psychoanalyst's couch, reading is a difficult intellectual process. Superscript 2. Superscript 2. The anonymous children in Bettelheim and Ewen's book spent a good deal of time on that couch. The authors reported that their study of 300 children in 8 schools revealed that reading errors often had deep meanings, that young readers made mistakes not because they were unable to decode the text, but often because they understood it quite well, sufficiently to reject it for what to them seemed valid reasons. Superscript 2. Superscript 3. They buttressed this claim, not with any hard research, though they had a foundation grant and 6 female assistants to sup them. Superscript 2. 4. But with Bettelheim's usual soup of anecdotes, there was the small, very competent first grader who read Ticker for Tiger, which meant that she was taking refuge from the fierce jungle cat in the benign land of Winnie the Pooh. Superscript 2. 5. Or the highly intelligent first grader who substituted dump for jump, which meant he wanted to dump his boring workbook, which the authors said he told them was garbage. Superscript 2. 6. Bettelheim had long insisted that education should not be made easy, that children should learn to fear. He also had complained that too often the educator who should know better fools himself and the child into believing that if something has meaning as the expression, it is therefore psychoanalytic impulse to applaud all on the ground that it reveals something. Superscript 2. 7. Now he and Ewen were giving their class a standing ovation. We believe, they wrote, that the ability to read is seriously interfered with when purposeful behavior, as we assume sick misreadings to be, is regarded to be without deeper meaning, and is ascribed to ignorance, lack of skills, or neurological deficit. Superscript 2. 8. But surely, Robert Dudley had told Bettelheim with a certain frustration when working on the manuscript, surely there must be thousands of misreadings that have no discernible underlying purpose, that are just plain confusions or carelessnesses. Superscript 2. The authors were not inclined to listen to their editor, or even to their deity, who is said to have observed, albeit likely in a different context, that sometimes a cigar is only a cigar. Superscript 3 degrees. The tribute by Bettelheim to that deity soon provided distraction from the generally negative response to unlearning to read. With the help of Gottlieb, Joyce Jack, and Karen Raines, he had converted his Stanford talk on the mistranslation of Freud into a lengthy article. It ran in the New Yorker, which I now had done more than any other publication to legitimize the author. His attack on Lena Wertembler and Ferenc Dipres had the magazine's imprimatur, as had an excerpt from the uses of enchantment superscript 3 superscript 1. Peter Gay had lavishly praised The Empty Fortress in its pages, and a favorable review of On Learning to Read had recently appeared there. Superscript 3 superscript 2. His submissions received a careful editing for which the magazine was noted, and the Freud article emerged as one of the smoothest essays the author had ever published. One he expanded into a 118-page book, Freud and Man Soul. Superscript 3 superscript 3. Bettelheim maintained that the English translation of Freud's works, especially the 24-volume standard edition overseen by James Strachey, had drained Freud of his humanism. In particular, he faulted Strachey for printing Die Seele from the master's works. He wrote that in German soul has a deep spiritual connotation that was central to Freud's thinking. In the standard edition, Die Seele and its variants usually emerge as mind or indel or mental Bettelheim complaint. For example, that a phrase like "Wie berhaupt unser Seelenleben beherrscht," which means dominates the life of our soul, became via Strachey dominates our whole mental life. Superscript 3. For such mistranslations had seriously subverted Freud's intent, had made his humane ideas and insights abstract, depersonalized, highly theoretical, scientific. This to his students from the beginning at Rockford College, and at the orthogenic school had made it plain to his young counselors that he would not stand for a lot of psychoanalytic gibberish at staff meetings or in their dictation. Instead, they had to look into themselves, deep into their souls and the souls of the children, if they had to understand Freud's theories and make therapeutic progress. Superscript 3.6. There is a certain romanticism in this instruction. But Bettelheim was right that Strachey had scientized some of Freud's writing. For example, he took Freud's coinage Verliestung, which means the kind of unconscious mistake that became known as a Freudian slip, and literally turned it into a Greek praxis. And Strachey gave us more Greek by translating Freud's scholast, which roughly means the sexual pleasure of looking. As Scopode, Bettelheim also criticized Strachey for his Latin words, in particular for converting direct human terms like itch, yes, and user itch to the cold ego, id, and superego. Superscript 3.7. He did not concern himself much with the awkward alternative of writing and speaking in English about the idea and the above I, perhaps because for 40 years he had repeatedly used the Latin words in his articles and books, e.g., that if something has meaning as the expression it is therefore ego correct and would continue to do so. Freud and Man's Soul offers a total of 7 source notes and no bibliography, giving the unschooled reader the impression that Bettelheim was breaking new ground, the notion the author reinforced on the first page by wondering why, given the inadequacies and downright errors in the translations, others had not criticized them long ago. Superscript 3.8. Many others had, among them Louis Brandt, who in 1961 had published some notes on English Freudian terminology, and H. Frank Roll, who had offered a reconsideration of some translations of Sigmund Freud in 1975. Superscript 3. Such examiners occasionally came up with the same criticisms Bettelheim would advance, but unlike him they made clear that they understood that translation is always at best an imprecise enterprise and recognized the heroic accomplishment that Strachey had achieved in producing what in the minds of at least 7 translation scholars was a magnificent work. For degrees, moreover, as Bettelheim himself noted for Superscript 1, the standard edition had the approval of Freud as well as his daughter, Anna, who was deeply involved in the translation, and Sigmund's close friend and biographer, Ernest Jones, found Strachey's Freud considerably more trustworthy than any German version. Standard edition was a conspiracy and strict discipline, not a codified creed. More important, he wanted it open to lay analysts. In the United States, the profession was medicalized against his wishes, but it is a major leap, as Darius Gray Ornstein points out in translating Freud, to insist, as Bettelheim did, that Strachey and Anna Freud, who were two of the most prominent lay analysts of their day and devoted to Sigmund, connived with the Americans against Freud's explicit arguments. For superscript 3, they were motivated, in Bettelheim's words, by a deliberate wish to perceive Freud within the framework of medicine. 44, which was why they systematically replaced words in ordinary use with medical terms and learned borrowings from Greek and Latin. 45, however many legitimate mistranslations Bettelheim may have spotted, his astonishing accusation suggests that what motivated him was his unabated rage at the American psychoanalytic establishment for keeping him at arm's length throughout his career. Bettelheim's disapproval of the Strachey translation also reveals a kind of cranky wistfulness, a man nearing 80 looking back after a lifetime of achievement in an alien culture and an alien language to the happiness and security of the gymnasium, the city and the language of his youth. 46, not long after Freud and Man's Soul appeared, he was immersed in Vienna again, this time with a long essay review of a book about Freud, and the latter's patient and lover, Sabina Spielrein. 47, Bettelheim's growing nostalgia surfaces in his letters as well. The time to live was during the reign of Franz Joseph, he wrote to Carl Frankenstein. How incredibly smart of Freud to see to it that most of his life, at least his creative life, was lived during that time. 48, a few months later, he congratulated Frankenstein on publishing a book of stories in German. My German is gone, Bettelheim lamented, although in my old age I practically every night dream about something in Vienna, often mixed in with something American. The two worlds were not integrated but came to him side by side. 4, not long after moving to California, he told Nancy Dayton that he guessed he was an American, or as much as an old Viennese Jew ever can be American. 5 degrees in 1983, Bettelheim's longing for his roots pulled him once again to Europe, this time to mark his 80th birthday, on August 28th. Both he and Trude approached the journey with some trepidation. She had now been struggling with cancer for more than 4 years, and though her condition was stable, she remained weak and housebound much of the time, and he had suffered new medical setbacks. The previous summer, he had undergone an operation to repair a detached retina in his right eye. That procedure had led to a urinary tract obstruction that left it. 4 days later, surgeons anesthetized him again and operated on his benign enlarged prostate gland. In all, Bettelheim spent 13 days in the hospital and many weeks recuperating. It was now a year later, but the 1-2 punch, combined with his several other ailments, had left him, like Trude, feeling more frail than ever. Still, he was determined to give himself the trip as a present, fearing that it might be his last chance to touch the old world. They flew to New York, spent a few days with friends, regathered their strength, then went on to London for 8 delightful weeks seeing more friends, play-going, and visiting with Eric, who was now practicing international law in the branch of an American firm there. They next traveled to Venice for a week, which they enjoyed even though they felt limited by their respective infirmities. 5 superscript 1, the last stop on the month-long excursion was Switzerland, where both Trude and Bruno looked forward to a happy reunion with their old friends Sima, Rina, and Bertel Radenoich Hartmann, who lived in Basel. Trude looked very bad when she stepped off the train, Sima, Rina recalled. Still, within hours they had all made the short trip to Zurich to visit their host's daughter, Christine. Trude was stubborn about it. She insisted on going, in bad, rainy weather, Sima, Rina told me. The two couples convened with Christine in a restaurant, where Trude soon collapsed. They took her back to Christine's apartment and urged her to rest, but she soon astounded everyone by demanding that they all go to a movie. She would not be denied. In the cab to the cinema, she collapsed again, and this time was rushed to a hospital. Congestive heart failure was the diagnosis, and her condition was so critical that the doctor asked Bruno if he and his wife had an agreement about prolonging life. Yes, he said, no extraordinary measures. He was beside himself with fear, Sima Rina recalled. All 3 children flew to Trude's bedside and she began to rally when she saw them, and after 9 days in intensive care the doctors said she could leave the hospital. However, Getting her back to the United States would be a risky and expensive undertaking, and in desperation Bruno called Sandy Louise in New York. Louis, who had attended the orthogenic school in the 1950s, was one of the former director's prized alumni. Louis was grateful for the care he had received at the school, and had once named the family dog Bruno. He told me that Bettelheim was in tears, like a child. He said he never should have taken True to Europe, that their doctor without her. Louis came from considerable. He had given a substantial sum to the University of Chicago, instructing that the income be used exclusively to enhance Bettelheim's pension. Now, with typical command, the 43-year-old businessman hired a Swissair rescue plane to fly True from Zurich to Frankfurt, a necessity because Swissair would not permit the oxygen equipment she required in its cabins. Lufthansa did agree to allow the crucial support system, so Louis purchased the sections of a non-stop flight from Frankfurt to San Francisco, and, with Bruno, her physician, and a nurse attending her, True returned home, first to the Stanford Hospital for a few days, then to one's airplane. After the return, Bruno made what Louis termed a classic Bettelheim call. He phoned me not to say thank you but to tell me that I never had to do anything for him again, said Louis, who was infuriated by the remark but recognized that it typified the difficulty Bettelheim had in expressing appreciation. It was now clear that True might die any day. Her husband felt deserted, and as often happens in such situations, his fear turned to anger. Even before the crisis in Zurich, he had railed at his ailing wife, as if she had purposely allowed the cancer to invade her body to make him miserable. He saw my mother's illness as something that was happening to him, Naomi told me. He knew that once she died he would not be able to manage. He knew that someone would have to take care of him. Who would that be? As he looked into this void, he lost control again and again. Naomi declined to be specific about her father's explosions, saying only that his behavior was inexcusable, as it had been on occasion years before in Hyde Park, when her mother had retreated in tears after he had angrily unloaded his woes on her. When his own needs came first, he could be blind to other people's needs, totally blind, and would do or say things that nobody in a normal state of mind would say or do, his daughter told me. True's strong constitution and will to survive kept her alive for more than a year. In the spring of 1984, she and Bruno managed a trip to New York, where she went to museums in a wheelchair and attended one or two plays, though in some cases only for one act, because she tired so easily. By August, she was undergoing more radiation to relieve the bone cancer's excruciating pain. The treatment helped somewhat but left her further weakened. On October 25th, Eric arrived from England for 3 days. After he left, on Sunday, the regular evening Scrabble game, but she quickly grew. Hours later, she had a heart attack. An ambulance took her to the hospital, and by morning she was dead, 12 days after her 73rd birthday. Several days later, Bruno poured out his grief in a letter to Carl Frankenstein. I owe to her all I am, he wrote, saying True's love had encouraged him to resume his studies at the University of Vienna in 1937 and to get his degree, and that same selfless devotion had made it possible for him to overcome his depression and make a successful career in the United States. He had tried to prepare himself for the inevitable over the last year, but could not do it. He had never been able to grasp the possibility that his healthy, sportive wife would die before he did. She had been strong for so long, which was one reason she had refused to move into any kind of retirement home. Once she fell ill, such places refused to take them. I do not know how I'll be able to carry on, but I shall try, since this is what she would have wanted. 5 superscript to only a few weeks after True died, Margaret Bettelheim committed suicide. For 15 years, Bruno's sister had lived at the Williams, a residential hotel for the elderly on Manhattan's Upper West Side. After her husband, Peter Abbott, died in 1974, she had moved from their suite into a small studio apartment and had led an increasingly lonely existence. Like her brother, she was prone to depression that dated back to the suffocating years of their father's syphilis, but unlike Bruno, She had not been able to create the rewarding life for herself in America. She had hoped to use her European acting experience to make a career in radio, but whereas her brother's thick Austrian accent was one of his most useful assets in the world of psychotherapy, hers was a fatal debit. She had a modest gift for playing the stock market, and was a handsome woman, regal almost, and always impeccably dressed, but essentially she had to settle for being the wife of a hotel maitre d'. A lifelong smoker, she had been plagued by emphysema for several years, and now suffered from painful dental problems as well. In mid-December, the month after she turned 85, she washed sleeping pills and possibly other drugs down with a heavy dose of whiskey. Just before she did so, she called Catherine Wilhelm, whom she had first met in Vienna in the 1930s and who had become one of her close U.S.C. friends in New York. I had no idea what she was contemplating, Wilhelm recalled. The only thing that surprised me was that at the end of our very intentional conversation she said, "Thank you for letting me talk to you." Margaret lingered in the hospital for about a week, during which Bruno asked his young friend to make sure that the doctors made no heroic effort. He had greatly admired her younger brother. She had saved magazine cover photos of him, and his cherished books lined her shelves. But Bruno had kept her at a distance since the days of their youth, when he sought refuge from her at the Bucks Mountains. He had talked to her occasionally by phone. And when in Manhattan had tried to fit her in between meetings with Robert Gottlieb and Karen Raines and social gatherings with Hans and Wanda Whitlick and other friends. She was resentful of that, Naomi said, but it was typical of my father's relationships, no empathy or understanding for where she was. Margaret died on December 22nd, and when Bruno wrote Carl Frankenstein 4 days later he did not mention her, nor did he in subsequent letters to Joyce, Jack, and Nancy Dayton. Not long after her death, he came to New York and stayed at the Stanhope Hotel, where he and Alvin Rosenfeld had dinner and then went up to his room. There he opened a briefcase and started going through his sister's effects and talking about how her promise as an actress had never flowered into a career. Margaret's life spilled from the pictures she had left behind, and as Rosenfeld sat beside his old and tired colleague on the bed, Bettelheim gazed at them with great sadness. In the months before and after Trude and Margaret's deaths, the world seemed always ready to comfort their anguished husband and brother with recognition and generosity. He received honorary degrees from the State University of New York at Albany, the University of Santa Clara, Tulane University, and Bard College, which cited him as one of the great 20th century figures in psychology and education and saluted his legendary record of success in severely emotionally disturbed children. 5 superscript 3 In the spring of 1983, the Goethe Institute, whose headquarters in Munich was about 10 miles from Dachau, awarded Bettelheim its Goethe mené, saying his work in child psychology particularly embodied the spirit of German culture. 54 That same year, he appeared briefly as himself in Woody Allen's mock documentary Zelig, the parody about a mousy young man who mirrors the strong characteristics of people he encounters. In a cameo as a quintessential Viennese psychoanalyst, Bettelheim expounds soberly on how Zelig represents conformity. For Christmas 1985, Sandy Lewis gave Bruno a new Mercedes, and the following spring, many of his former colleagues at the Orthogenic School and the University of Chicago gave him a Festschrift on the campus. That same year, the British Broadcasting Corporation aired a 2-hour documentary on Bettelheim, whom the narrator called of the world's greatest living psychologist. He was among the survivors by Sigmund Freud and had worked successfully with MRI, including a deeply disturbed autistic child sent to him by Anna Freud. Sandy Lewis, who helped underwrite the tribute, appeared on camera, saying that Bettelheim had demonstrated that hopeless cases could be rescued. Bert Collar also praised the former director, as did another former resident, identified only as Tony, who said she had been suicidal when she arrived at the Orthogenic School and that its enveloping miles, Lou had saved her life. 55 In September 1987, Bettelheim returned to Vienna to participate in an international symposium on the emigration and exile of Austrian science. He was pleased to be invited, and he gave a warm speech summing up his life and work in the United States. But he minced no words about Austrian President Kurt Waldheim, The former Nazi who had been Secretary General of the United Nations, Bettelheim, also wondered aloud how many contemporary Viennese thought of him as a dirty, stinking Jew. A remark that appeared in the Socialist or an Audiobook cited just as he said it. Rudolf Eckstein, his friend and fellow honoree, told me that Bettelheim had mixed emotions about homage from Austria was hardly surprising, but he sometimes seemed even less inclined to accept his domestic honors with grace, often displaying the same petulance that he had after winning the National Book Award. Instead of going along with the comic spirit of Zelig, he groused to his symposium audience in Vienna that Woody Allen had not allowed him to say anything deep about psychoanalysis, which he said was typical of how Americans viewed the discipline. 56. He was pleased that Bert Collar, Ben Wright, Leslie Arrett, now Bob Bergman, and his old friend Ben Bloom and others had been moved to organize the Festschrift in 1986, and was happy that so many former staff members and residents came to see him. In his old den, just 126, or at the Quadrangle Club, he listened gratefully and was often touched as more than a dozen speakers praised him at Mondale Hall. But at a party for more than 100 guests that Bruno gave in her home, he complained that the university should have arranged the event. He was wrecking the meaning of it right in front of me, Bruno recalled. 2 weeks after the gathering, Bettelheim described it in a letter to Nancy Dayton. The university reacted by taking no notice of it, or me. So there you are. 57. In the fall of 1986, a few months after the Festschrift, Bettelheim branched himself from Portola Valley and moved in with his daughter Ruth. He had resisted the idea at first, despite his disdain for those dumps for old people called retirement homes. He had applied to one in Palo Alto that since his mind was still active psychological help to the other residents, but the institution turned him down, supposedly because I am too old. Although there might have been other reasons why they blackballed me. 58. He desperately needed someone to take care of him, to replace Trude. Eric lived in London. Naomi and her husband were still in Vienna, that left Ruth. Originally, she and her husband planned to build a wing for him on their own house, a large, 1,920s vintage Hollywood home in the hills of Pasadena. Not long after they began construction, however, their marriage of 10 years began falling apart, and now they were in the middle of a messy divorce. 5. At Ruth's urging, Bruno agreed to buy a house out of the proceeds of the Portola Valley sale and come live with her and her 2 children. She had chosen an imposing Spanish-style dwelling at 718 Adelaide Place, one of Santa Monica's tonier addresses. It cost her father more than $800,000, part of which he borrowed from a New York bank on Sandy Lewis's guarantee. 6 degrees. Several friends had urged Bruno to stay in the Bay Area, including Gina, who still lived in San Francisco, had never remarried after Peter Weinman's death, and had offered to help her first husband reorganize his life. Naomi and Eric, too, thought he should remain near Stanford, where he had found kindred spirits over the last 13 years. The move had disaster written all over it, Eric recalled. It led to one of the only falling outs I ever had with my father. Naomi and I, and Gina, were dead set against the idea. Ruth was going through what was showing itself to be a very acrimonious divorce. She had a professional practice of her own, but she was not independently wealthy, so she could not provide the kind of care that someone who was rich could. For her to take on this responsibility for a man in his 80s, very sick, was to ask too much of anyone. The house itself was inappropriate. It's really a home for formal entertaining, with large, open rooms, not discreet private rooms that would allow 2 adults to live separately. I was so vehement about it that I proposed that my father come to England. I'm a bachelor. I'm reasonably well off. But he would have none of it. By Christmas, the mix of generations and personalities under the reddish tile roof at 718 Adelaide was already beginning to chafe. Bruno, his dead wife, was deep in general, and the house in particular, which which he regarded as ostentatious. Ruth was 44, still tense from the breakup of her marriage. Unbending and dogmatic, much like her father, practicing psychotherapy at home as Dr. Bettelheim, and caring for her 11-year-old son, Matthew, and her 5-year-old daughter, Doria. Their normal rambunctiousness frequently irritated their grandfather, whose own children had always understood that they had to tiptoe when he was working. His small study was just to the right of the front door, protected from the noisy traffic flow and the children's invasion only by the curtain. At Christmas time, he wrote with longing of the warm holidays he and Trude had made for the family on Kenwood Avenue and complained that Ruth was in revolt against everything in her past, including Christmas. Not that I mind much. It is just another emptiness for me. 6 superscript 1. As Bettelheim struggled to breathe in this alien atmosphere, he managed to publish his 15th book, A Good Parent, the title whose irony would tighten like a vice in the months ahead. He had worked on and off at the book since the mid-1970s, never to the satisfaction of Robert Gottlieb. The author accused his editor of wanting a how-to book, which was to some extent true, but Bettelheim was also having trouble producing a coherent manuscript of any kind. By the early 1980s, he was on a forced march to complete the project, because he had accepted a large advance from Knotts and, as writers frequently do, had already spent it. He had had little choice but to soldier on, with Joyce Jack in close step, at a time when he felt weary and dispirited. By 1985, Gottlieb still regarded the book as unpublishable and arranged to have it extensively rewritten. The reason is quite clear to me, Bettelheim told Nancy Dayton. Gottlieb has great problems as a father and have done everything opposite of what I advocate. So in self-defense he had to rewrite the book so as to justify himself as a parent. 6 superscript 2. For all the strains between author and publisher, the book that emerged in 1987 gave readers a more temperate Bettelheim, an author who now spoke in almost grandfatherly tones. He was still polishing his as if about caring for 2 autistic children in his Vienna home. Adding a few other youngsters. 6 superscript 3. He was still working almost exclusively within the Freudian frame, and he was still writing about American families as if they were all white and affluent and had maids, and as if single motherhood were a rarity. But he was no longer sounding so much like an Old Testament prophet. W. Winnicott's concept of reassuring them that they ought not try to be perfect or expect their children to become so. 64. Instead, he repeats the central theme of his life's work. The one idea approaching a theory that he ever advanced. Parents should work to understand why their children behaved as they did. Try to comprehend their sons' and daughters' turmoil by drawing on their own inner experience. 65. For the first time, he revealed some details of his own youth. Writing of playing under the dining room table, of his beloved cousin, Edith, of his father's card games, of how his mother cared for him when he was sick, of his very good parents. 66. This softer Bettelheim also was evident in his interview with the BBC, which he had taped in Portola Valley a few weeks after Trude's death. If I have any regrets, he said, it is that I did not emphasize the difficulties also parents have. He reiterated that he had seen his task as being the advocate for the orthogenic school children, but now realized that it was important to be the advocate for mothers, too. He said that if he had another lifetime to live, he would spend a lot of it trying to help mothers understand how difficult it had become to raise children in contemporary society, to help them have compassion for themselves as well as for their children. 67. Bettelheim also now seemed, at least at times, to have developed some second thoughts about blaming Holocaust victims. In 1986, the same year the BBC documentary appeared, he spoke at the University of Southwestern Louisiana about Janusz Korczak, the Polish author of the 1928 children's novel King Mat I, about a boy who becomes king and tries to reform his realm on behalf of children as well as adults. Korczak, born Henryk Goldsmith, had been head of the Jewish orphanage in Warsaw for many years, and Bettelheim talked with great admiration of this man precisely because he had not fought back against the Nazis. Unlike Bettelheim's heroic dancer, Korczak had not shot one of his captors before his death, nor had he killed the police who came for him, as Bettelheim had insisted Otto Frank should have. Instead, he had refused several opportunities to save himself so he could stay with his orphans and make their last hours as secure as possible before their and his extermination at Trebling Kur. Bettelheim quoted the last words in Korczak's ghetto diary with reverence. I am angry with nobody. I do not wish anybody evil. I am unable to do so. I do not know how one can do it. 68. The tone throughout the talk suggests Bettelheim deeply envied Korczak's wisdom and humanity, and not only because of his ultimate selflessness at Trebling Kur. Like Bettelheim, Korczak reckoned summoned from the way he had been raised, arbitrary and abusive behaviors that can arise out of an adult's unhappy childhood. Korczak established a children's court at his orphanage. He was called before it 5 times in a 6-month period, once for losing his temper and hitting a child who had irritated him. He readily admitted his guilt, and that the seriousness of the provocation could not serve as an excuse for slapping the child. Bettelheim wrote. 6. Bettelheim tried to make a life for himself in Santa Monica. He renewed his friendship with his fellow exile Rudolf Eckstein, and they spent many Saturday lunches at Margins at the Mart, a delicatessen near their homes, talking about their youth, trying to feel Vienna's cobblestones beneath their feet. 7 degrees every Thursday evening. Bettelheim supervised 6 local therapists in a case study group. He complained often that he had no friends, but several people did try to get close to him, drawn both by his neediness and his reputation. One was Constance Katzenstein, who had grown up in Hyde Park and had taken Bettelheim's courses in the 1940s. Her father had died when she was an infant, and her powerful teacher became, as he did for so many others, her mentor, father figure. Katzenstein, who was about 60 when they renewed their acquaintance, made a concerted effort to bring Bettelheim out of his gloom, with distractions like a German expressionist exhibit at a local museum and parties at her home. It was at one of these that he confided that his father had suffered from syphilis for so many years. Yet, despite this rare and intimate revelation, he seemed unable to show his hostess any warmth for her devotion. 7 Superscript 1. In November 1987, Bruno spent 4 or 5 days with Naomi, who had given birth to her first child in Austria and with her husband had just moved back to a suburb of Washington, D.C. Her father had kept up a demanding writing and speaking pace during the year and had recently returned from the symposium in Vienna. He was clearly exhausted, and soon suffered a disease spell and later realized that he couldn't hold up his right hand. It was obviously the beginning of a stroke, but neither of us recognized it, Naomi recalled. She urged that he see a doctor, but he was determined to honor yet another speaking engagement in Florida. By the time he arrived, he had to be rushed to the hospital. When Ruth heard, she gathered up Matthew and Aurelia and took the night flight to his bedside, then brought him back to Santa Monica. The stroke partially paralyzed Bettelheim's right arm and hand, which impaired his ability to write and type and drove him deeper into despair. He now became obsessed with what would happen to him. 718 Adelaide Place was large but Ruth, Bruno, and the children each had a bedroom, but there was no place for a live-in nurse. Ruth considered creating a room above the garage for her office, but refused to pay for it, in part because she did not have title to the house. It was owned by a trust her father had established, which gave him the right to sell it whenever he chose, regardless of his daughter's wishes. A substantial portion of his estate was tied up in the house, and he now decided, partly on Eric's advice, that, given his age and Carlo's health, this was no time to hold on to any liquid asset. For 15 months, Ruth had tried to be the caretaker her father demanded, and he had tried as best he could to adapt to what they both knew was an untenable situation. Over their second Christmas in the house, the tension only grew worse, and he finally announced that he was determined to sell and move to a place of his own. Ruth may well have been relieved that she would no longer have to live in such proximity to her father, but she was furious that he was pulling the house out from under her and her children. 7 Superscript 2. A few weeks after the decision, Bruno suffered an inflammation of the pancreas and was admitted to the hospital. He was real in the morning, but, according to Naomi, Ruth waited until she had a break from her patients in the afternoon to pick him up. In Naomi's view, this triggered a total mental breakdown. Back at 718 Adelaide, Bruno became clear, even accusing Ruth of trying to poison him. He was soon on antidepressants and other drugs. Father and daughter barely spoke, and endless phone calls crossed the country at all hours as Naomi and others tried to heal the breach. Naomi, at 42 pregnant with her second child, feared she would have a miscarriage and ended up with enforced bed rest. In May, Bruno moved a few blocks away to a condominium apartment on Ocean Avenue that looked out across the Pacific. Ruth and his grandchildren would take up residence only a short walk away, but he did not know their address or seem to care what it was. The trustee eventually sold the house for about $1.2 million to a young couple named Frankie and Barry Sholem, who told me that when they called Ruth to say that mail had come for her father, she never picked it up. A few months after giving birth to her second child, Naomi went out to Santa Monica and shuttled between her father and sister trying to effect the rapprochement. Both were intransigent. Ruth continued to seethe over the house sale, and also accused the Dr. Bettelheim of trying to destroy her career. He had repeatedly and publicly disparaged the house as pretentious and her Southern California, he would say in an eventually published intellectual incubator of Hyde Park, had embraced values that he found undesirable. 74 The interviewer, David James Fisher, a young analyst who had befriended Bruno, told me that he was far more bitter about Ruth than comes across in the interview. He took nasty shots at her in my presence, criticizing her for not having a sliding scale for her patients but charging all the high fees. Fisher, an historian of psychoanalysis, was drawn to the older therapist's tales of Austria between the wars, of how as a member of the Wandervogel he had lost the girl to Otto Phoenixel in the Vienna woods but found Freud, of his treatment of Patsy, of his analysis with Richard Stirp, of how Freud himself had told him that with his background in humanities he was just the kind of practitioner psychoanalysis needed. 75 Fisher visited Bettelheim often, first at the house, then in his apartment. And at least twice Bettelheim dined with the young therapist and his wife in their home. They were considering adopting a child, and their gift said emphatically that they should do so. That surrogate parenting was by no means fatal. He then described how his own mother had not given him the emotional and physical love that he needed but had turned him over to a wet nurse. "Look at me. I didn't turn out so bad," he told his hosts. But he felt worse than bad, and talked constantly of suicide. The subject came up so often that Fisher and a friend, a professor of history at UCLA named Peter Lowenberg, persuaded Bettelheim to enter analysis. "I said, this will have to be a very distinguished and very old analyst. Bruno got a kick out of that," Fisher recalled. Lowenberg suggested a woman named Miriam Williams, whose office was just down Ocean Avenue from Bettelheim's apartment. Like her new patient, she had been born in the old Austro-Hungarian monarchy and spoke with a heavy accent. They had sessions once and sometimes twice a week, speaking in both English and German. Williams declined to divulge the details of their talks, but did say that Bettelheim rarely spoke about his parents and that his feeling of homeliness came up often. After about a year, he stopped coming. He decided that talking wasn't enough, that he had to go out and end his life, Williams said. When Bruno and Naomi spoke on the phone every week, he almost always talked of killing himself. At the time, her 3-year-old son was going through a serious crisis about death. "I specifically told my father that this was a topic he could not discuss in front of my children," said Naomi. But he could not always keep the sluice closed, and more ill the boy killed himself in the Adelaide Place house with Matthew and Aurelia present. Bettelheim's emotional misery was compounded more and more by his physical disabilities, not least a blockage in his esophagus. At a Fisher dinner party, rice lodged in his throat and caused such a coughing jack that he had to be escorted to the bathroom. He had rejected for several years having an operation that would alleviate this problem, but his doctor now told him that he might die if he resisted surgery any longer. 76 In the summer of 1988, he entered the hospital once again. The procedure was a success, though he came out of it with a case of pneumonia. Still, he was thrilled to discover after his throat healed that he could once again enjoy sitting down to a meal. He was now able to cut into the kind of heavy fare he enjoyed, and occasionally played the courtly host to his new acquaintances at Knowles, the German restaurant on Wilshire Boulevard. The attentiveness of these people seldom distracted him for long. His lifelong friend Fritz Rettel had died in February, and Nancy Dayton, whom he had known since she was a student at the University of Chicago and with whom he had carried on an intimate father-daughter correspondence for more than a decade, had succumbed to breast cancer in the summer of 1987. He continued to regard his flesh and blood oldest daughter as uncaring and superficial, and Ruth remained unbending. He spent long days in his apartment, enshrouded in the European artifacts he and Trude had so lovingly assembled over 40 years. For many hours he sat in his familiar Danish modern chair and read, but the pages did not always bring him peace. "I am reading Primo Levi," he wrote to Carl Frankenstein in March 1988, "and am again filled with the problems of the survivor. Hitler ruined all our lives and continues to do so, because it is only because of him that you are in Israel and I am here. And that Israel came into being and causes all Jews so much anguish." 77 Constance Katzenstein and a sculptor named James Ullman hoped that sitting for a bust might help cheer Bettelheim up. They contacted Sandy Louise, who readily agreed to pay Ullman's $6,000 fee but wanted as many people as possible to contribute whatever they could, so the bust would not just be from him. "Before I started," Ullman told me, "I called up everyone I knew who knew him, to get an idea of him so I could reflect it in the bust. Nobody had anything nice to say. She said that their half-dozen sessions were difficult, that he tended to be unpleasant and monosyllabic as she worked. To try and close the gap, she organized a dinner party around him. He acted as if I were a son to be displayed at the orthogenic school, but acting it black, disembodied head might frighten the children, and it was relegated to the library. And now rests in the business office." By the beginning of 1989, Bettelheim was getting specific about suicide. He talked to his young confidant, Jimmy Fisher, about taking an overdose of drugs, yet feared he might not absorb them, might vomit them up or have to have his stomach pumped. He contemplated jumping from his fifth-floor apartment, but rejected that method because it might leave him further crippled instead of dead. Fisher heard him ask a physician about the efficacy of injecting air into his veins, and also about how much Demerol constituted a lethal dose. The doctor said between 100 and 200 milligrams. Fisher wrote, Bettelheim inquired of this doctor if he would be willing to prescribe the medicine. The physician declined. 78 in April, Bettelheim began arranging to go to Holland, where doctor-assisted suicide by lethal injection was legal. Fritz Rettel's widow, Helen, had given him the name of a physician, January Schouten, who expressed a willingness at least to meet with his supplicant if he came to Amsterdam. 7 Bruno wanted Eric to take him there. And for a while his son reluctantly entertained the idea, but he ultimately refused to participate in the plan. Naomi was strenuously opposed from the start. Their father then found a couple in Los Angeles who said they would accompany him on the trip, but they wanted some form of consent from his children. He spent Thanksgiving with Naomi and her family outside Washington, much of the time trying to persuade her to give these Los Angeles strangers permission to help him kill himself. She flatly refused, and no longer, only because she had serious misgivings about the plan itself. Some months before, she had heard from a family friend that her father had disinherited Ruth. I was shocked, Naomi told me. I didn't want to believe this person at first, but then I found out it was true. She had gone to Santa Monica to try and get him to reverse the decision, summoning the memory of Trude. Surely he knew that she would never have sanctioned such retribution. He was adamant. Again, she went back and forth between her father and sister trying to at least get them talking. But the break was beyond repair. Now, during the Thanksgiving holidays, she reminded her father that if committed suicide with the will in its present form, there was bound to be a very nasty court battle, through which the innocent Los Angeles couple would inevitably be dragged. I was bound and determined that the will had to be changed back, Naomi said. Her father was considering moving east into a nursing home near his home. She would give him no peace until he himself came down from New York to see Bettelheim at Naomi's. She gave her father a taste of what she meant by revealing the disinheritance to his friend, who was almost as disapproving as she was. Naomi made it clear that she would also tell her father's other friends, and he knew that they would not approve, either. As 1990 began, most of those friends received a formal card announcing that he had moved to the Charter House, a home for the elderly in Silver Spring, Maryland. Before he left Santa Monica, he grudgingly restored Ruth as an heir. 8 degrees in early 1990, Knox published Bettelheim's final book, Vienna and Other Essays. It consists almost exclusively of reprinted articles, which Joyce, Jack, and Karen Raines helped him assemble. He knew the book needed an introduction, but he told Jack he was burned out and managed to send her only fragments. I wrote the introduction for him, Jack told me, saying it was the only time in their collaboration that such ghosting had occurred. It was obvious he could no longer put down his thoughts, and it distressed him terribly. Among the essays is Essential Books of One's Life, which he had published in a Swiss magazine in 1988. It was here that Bettelheim revealed for the first time how important the German philosophers Theodor Lessing, F. A. Planck, and Hans Pfister had been to him as a young man, how the philosophy of as it had taught him that living by fictions might be a way to make life bearable for someone who so often felt depressed and pessimistic. 8 superscript 1 That strategy had kept him a long way, but fictions could no longer help him. I am utterly miserable here and regret the move, but it can no longer be changed, he wrote to a friend on his new Charter House stationery on February 26.8 squared in A Good Enough Parent. He had written what has long been well known, that severely pathological behavior often surfaces on anniversaries of unhappy events. 8 superscript 3 On the night of March 12th, the day when, 52 years before, the Nazis invaded Austria, Bettelheim swallowed some drugs and whiskey and tied a plastic bag over his head. He was found the next morning in the hallway outside his room. The note in his typewriter read, I know you did everything possible to help me, and I am very grateful to both of you for everything you did for me. The two of you were the very best that happened to me since your mother's death. But I just can't not go on without her. I love you very much and want to thank you for all you did for me. Please forgive me, as much as you can. Have a good life now and in the future. Your loving father. Farewell. The note began. 84.